So I'll start with a story. About 7 years ago, in a weekend, I've gone through a deeply spiritual experience that had shattered my own sense of self and my worldview. It has been eye-opening and unbelievably beautiful. For more than a few timeless moments, the world appeared enchanted with colorful magic, and I've lost any sense of who I am. Reality seemed blissful and eternal, it was all rather confusing. That day had shaken me to my core, but this is not the reason why I'm telling you this. The reason is that the next day, not only did I manage to get back to normal reality again, but I've also attended an early morning neurobiology class. The topic was the visual system. And the neurons and photoreceptors, which I was hearing about, have all of a sudden acquired a new, much deeper meaning. Thank you. They were not only this extraordinarily complex system that I was studying, but rather they were part of what began to be a personal quest to make sense of who I am or who we are. And I'm telling you all this story because this connection, or perhaps this gap between my own lived experience and science has been occupying me since. It has led me to meet Aviva and Mathis, which are not only neuroscientists whose outstanding research focused on meditation for many years, they are also at the same time walking on a spiritual path. So today we come here to speak as scientists, but perhaps as scientists of the mind, we are of a peculiar form. For our own personal backgrounds are essential to understanding our motivation and our perspective of science, mind, and world. So today we will ask what place within the natural sciences is there for the reality of our minds? Is it even possible to make sense of our subjective experience of consciousness within a physical, objectivist science? So we will also try to ask how these questions not only are essential to do better science, but ultimately to change our understanding of the world and of ourselves. So I'm really not sure if we can completely answer these questions today, but I can tell you that they are the driving force of our research. It's confusing that I need to kind of hold this and not exercise things with my hands. Maybe I can do something like that. I'm really used to moving my hands quite excessively when I talk, and then not being able to do that. It's kind of limiting, which really relates to the kind of philosophy of mind that we're gonna present today. So we're gonna talk about our ongoing research, our own implementation of the paradigm of neurophenomenology, a science of mind that truly and rigorously embraces the reality of subjectivity. So our plan for today is that we will be presenting generally the paradigm of neurophenomenology as a distinct research program that is essentially a quest to marry modern cognitive science with a disciplined approach to human experience. A method that tries to find meaningful bridges between two irreducible phenomenal domains, that of experience and that of the physical nature of our world. So we will try to explain this research agenda and how it's fundamentally different from classical cognitive science, and what makes it fruitful to pragmatically advance our understanding of consciousness. So this introduction will lead us to the research done in Aviva's lab in the past decade, and we will particularly focus on the collaboration that is being done with meditators and yogis. The potential lies in this collaboration, in the unique intimacy and control they have over their conscious states and their ability to describe them with great detail and precision. So these unique qualities are at the heart of our ongoing neurophenomenological study about the dissolution of the sense of boundaries within meditative experience. By talking about our research, I hope to give you an idea of the pragmatic methodologies that we are using to allow a fruitful dialogue between neuroscience and human experience. Essentially, discuss the different levels of the necessary circulation between brain measures and description of subjective experience in a way that continually refines and develops an integrated understanding of our minds and our lived world. It is this circulation that I and Mathis are sort of living through by coming here, researching and lecturing together while coming from overlapping but different fields, neuroscience and phenomenology. So finally, we will ask what are the implications that this dialogue has for our values of the scientific community, and we will finish with an open panel discussion, hopefully, so we can deepen the dialogue. You are very welcome to ask questions that are clarifying, but for deeper questions, we could really get to that in the end. So write them down and try to exercise patience. So I'll start by giving some background of the philosophical considerations that motivated the construal of neurophenomenology and the closely related inactive approach to cognition. So we can start with the apparent dichotomies of ordinary conceptual discourse. In this contemplative crowd, they might not be as prevalent as they are in most neuroscience departments, but truly they underlie a lot of the modern scientific discourse. So the distinction between the physical and the mental, the body and the mind, the objective and the subjective, are not only at the heart of a lot of philosophical debates about the nature of reality, but I feel that in the past few days they have been continuously kind of coming up from you and from the speakers. So we're going to try and talk about that. Taking to the extreme, these metaphysical debates can also become violent. I don't know if you've been feeling these emotions, but I could say that on one corner of this philosophical interesting setup. So yeah, like we could think about this as a sort of philosophical boxing battle. Taking to the extreme, we have the widespread position that is usually associated with science of material realism, which takes the world to be fundamentally physical, and then takes our mind to be some special computer-like manifestation of this physical reality. The external world in that view is pre-given, and our minds somehow manage to represent it more or less faithfully. Objective measures that are gained by the scientific community get us ever closer to the world as it truly is, but that world appears many times to be disconnected from the lives that we lead, and it is value-free or simply meaningless. But then on the other corner, there's the idealist boxer, which you might relate to in some way. This approach takes our mental lives to be primary, and thus understand the world as constructed through our cognitive faculties, projecting our own pre-given mental structures onto a perceived world. Reality as it is forever beyond our grasp, and the problem of solipsism arises. How are we to ever make sense of this shared world that we are, shared natural world that we inhabit? So the point is that these dichotomies are a source of major philosophical problems. They confront us with the basic anxiety, epistemological and existential uncertainty, as we are helplessly trying to find safe grounds on which we can build our worldview. So in recent debates, it has been construed scientifically as the hard problem of consciousness that you might have heard of, which essentially asks, why should physical processing give rise to a rich inner life at all? It seems objectively unreasonable that it should, and yet it does. And then also the explanatory gap, which points towards the impossibility of giving a satisfying explanatory account of the mental in physical terms. So what can we do with this apparent gap? How can we as scientists deal with this issue? I think this was also like brought up before in Aviva's talk. What we want to offer is that rather than trying to solve this from within the boxing arena of dichotomies, perhaps we can try and step outside of it and stop thinking about the problem from a merely physicalist perspective. We can try and recalibrate our attitude towards it. So this is what basically neurophenomenology and the inactive approach offer us. Not a solution, there's something missing here, but a remedy to the hard problem of consciousness. And the remedy is by changing the entire framework within which the issue is discussed. So Francisco Varela, the inspiring Chilean biologist, philosopher, and also a Buddhist practitioner who's behind this approach, said that lived experience is where we start from and where we all must link back to. And what we're going to do is try to show how this can be implemented scientifically. But before that, the appreciation of lived experience is clearly inspired by the phenomenological approach. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's a philosophical method of the 20th century, or perhaps better, a kind of way of thinking which aims towards a careful and detailed exploration of human experience, its structure and dynamics. So one of its most distinct voices is Maurice Merleau-Ponty, a French thinker, who said that the whole universe of science is built upon the world as directly experienced. And if we want to subject science itself to rigorous scrutiny and arrive at a precise assessment of its meaning and scope, we must begin by reawakening the basic experience of the world, of which science is a second-order expression. So I'm guessing a lot of these kind of echoes things that have been said recently from different perspectives of yoga. But I want you to know that this is not really a metaphysical statement. It's not about like the primary of consciousness as a basic substrate of reality. Rather, it points towards the simple fact of our embodied reality. We are at the same time a knowing subject who perceives the world actively, the world of physical things, and interacts with it, come in contact with it. And we are also finding ourselves to be at the same time a bodily being, which is part of this very world and shaped by it. So this dual perspective of ourselves, coming into contact with the world while being part of it, is essential to understand the approach that we are offering. So this is in short the middle path that is offered by phenomenology in the more recent inactive approach to cognition. It sees cognition not as some functional information processing, but as embodied action, a dynamic interplay between the sensory motor capacities of the organism and of its environment. A complex range of circular interactions involving the brain, the body, and the environment. This is the concept that helps us think about all that is in action, which is construed, to use Evan Thompson's formulation, the exercise of skillful know-how in situated and embodied action. The way of thinking about this cognition, about cognition, is a big step away from the representational frameworks, because we stop trying to transcend the mind and body dichotomy, but rather we see us and the world as two sides of the same coin. Knower and known are mutually specified. So rather than clearly marking out differences, we are called to describe a network of intricate interrelations. The inactive approach gives us the conceptual tools to help us think about this fundamental circularity, not only between us and our surrounding, but also between lived experience and our rational understanding of things. The deep bond between consciousness and science is essential to this kind of dialectic. It calls us to lose our fixated rationale and accept the groundlessness or non-substantiality of our human condition, so that we could find our way to dynamically and dialectically advanced knowledge. So if you're hearing some Buddhist undertone under this, you're right, but we'll leave that aside. So I'm going to start now to talk more specifically on a scientific level. So neurophenomenology, again, is the proposed methodological research program that puts this philosophy into practice. The main idea is that cognitive sciences must be grounded in human experience. And this is essentially a call for putting out a rigorous method and explicit pragmatics for the exploration and analysis of experience. So specifically what is needed is a systemic exploration of the only link between mind and consciousness, the structure of human experience itself. Perhaps if we can get back to the metaphorical world of boxing, we could stop the fight between the physical and the mental, between perhaps yoga and science, and find a way to dance the neurophenomenological dance. That is to move back and forth, circulating between the scientific third-person perspective and the first-person human experience perspective. One of the crucial principles of neurophenomenology is that both of these domains of phenomena are irreducible to one another. They're in fact codetermined. And when I say that they are codetermined, I mean that any phenomenological account of the structure of experience and any neurobiological counterpart relate to one another through reciprocal constraints. That is, each guides and constrains the exploration and validation of the other. So we will try to give many examples, actual examples of this idea. So what I want to add is that this can really only be achieved by combining rigorous first-person methodology as developed by phenomenology and by contemplative traditions. Combining these with neuroscience. So the careful description of moment-to-moment experience can help us reveal and make sense of many hidden patterns of brain activity, as was already shown by Aviva. But to play this role, we must leave behind the attitude of just taking a look inside our minds. Perhaps people here coming from yoga can appreciate the challenge that is at hand. First-person research should be based on the kind of detailed exploration of the mind that Buddhists use in meditation, for instance. And also on interview techniques such as microphenomenology, which I will talk later about, but basically allows for more careful description of experience. So by collaborating, as Evan Thompson said, we can really gain a new scientific partner whose first-hand expertise in mental life can play an investigative role directly within science. Working together, we can create a new, unprecedented kind of self-knowledge, a way of knowing ourselves that unites cognitive science and the contemplative view of the mind from within. So I hope that I've been not too fussy about this philosophical introduction, and now Mathis will be able to make all this more concrete through our research.
Continue later.
Ohad will come back. Okay, can you hear me?
No.
No?
Try to have it up.
Now?
Yeah.
That sounds better. Okay. So I will try to make this more concrete and give you some very concrete examples of what neurophenomenology actually means when you are doing research. So I will first give two examples of some studies from the field. First study done by Antoine Lutz, and also Francisco Varela was involved in that one himself before he died, and which kind of gives a proof of concept that this idea can actually yield interesting results. And a second study that gives more an example of why it is actually interesting to collaborate with long-term meditators in this approach. So the first study by Antoine Lutz, they were working with a so-called illusory depth perception task. So this is something that is would be usually done in cognitive science. So here the participants would see a screen with random noise of black and white dots, and these dots are arranged by a computer program in a certain way that if you fixate the eyes behind the screen, it's actually not that easy, but if you kind of gaze behind the screen, suddenly a 3D shape pops up kind of in front of the screen. So this creates a depth perception.
Like, can you fix your microphone? It's very far away from your mic.
Yeah. Better now? Yeah, so so this will create this depth illusion. So far this could be a normal cognitive experiment. You could look at brain activity while we see this illusion or this depth perception versus a moment where we don't see it. So what makes this a neurophenomenological study? So what Lutz and his colleagues did, they provided a kind of a phenomenological training to the participants before they did the task. So they were doing this, and whenever they saw a shape appearing, they were asked to report about their experience. So how was it like to experience that shape? And these were open questions. So here's one example of an answer. I had a growing sense of expectation, but not for a specific object. However, when the figure appeared, I had a feeling of confirmation, no surprise at all. So this is just one example of how this can be experienced. And based on a lot of such reports, these researchers came up with a number of, actually 3 phenomenological categories, like 3 ways of how this can be experienced. One was called steady readiness, where a participant said, okay, I feel present, I'm in the here and now, and I have a subtle expectation that something will appear. And then this shape confirms that expectation. In a second category, they reported something that was called fragmented readiness. So they were putting some effort to make that shape appear, but then at the same time they were somehow distracted, their mind was wandering, and then it appeared. And in a third category, they were totally unready, they were thinking of the future or something, and then it suddenly surprised them that the shape appeared. So now we can come back to this paradigm and see what they actually did. So they provided the training, and then in the actual experiment, the participants could report on these phenomenological categories. And this actually provided interesting results in terms of the neural analysis. So in the trials where they reported to be prepared, there were some long distance synchronizations in the neural activity. So it seems that the brain kind of got into a preparatory state before the actual shapes appeared. So so this is just to show, or it's kind of a proof of concept that participants can report on quite subtle aspects of experience. They can report more than just saying I'm seeing this object or not. But they can report on what's called pre-reflective aspects of experience, and can thereby give information about the ongoing cognitive state. So the idea of Varela was that meditators are actually trained kind of naturally to report on these pre-reflective aspects, or these more subtle aspects of the mind. And the second study, which was already mentioned by Aviva, gives some more idea to, or fleshes out this idea a little bit more. So here, Garrison and colleagues, they gave real-time feedback of activity in this region, which is part of the default mode network, the posterior cingulate cortex. And as we know from Aviva's talk, this region usually activates when our mind wanders into the future or into the past, and it deactivates when we are concentrated on the here and now. And what was done in this study is that meditators were asked to use this real-time feedback graph of activity in this region as an object of their meditation, and to try to downregulate it while they were meditating. And one of the results was that meditators were actually much better in downregulating this graph, kind of giving some evidence to the idea that they have more familiarity with their mind and are able to entertain certain mental states. And here's just an example of how in a non-meditator this graph would keep fluctuating, where this versus for a meditator it would go down into the blue range. And as Aviva had mentioned, the researchers asked the meditators about the experience when the graph was either going into the red direction or into the blue direction. So here's an example for the red direction for activation of this region. The meditator says, I'm associating the red with some sort of intrusion of a thought. Whereas the deactivation, for the deactivation, a meditator says, I noticed that the more I relaxed and stopped trying to do anything, the bluer it went. And this kind of trying to stop trying to do anything, I think this is something you wouldn't expect from a non-meditator to report that. It's a more subtle aspect of our mind. So this kind of demonstrates the idea why it is interesting to work with meditators to explore the mind. And yeah, so this study actually gave a quite rich characterization of different experiential correlates of activation and deactivation of this region. So these are two examples of how neurophenomenology tries to bridge the perspective, the first-person perspective of experience and the third-person perspective of science. So what we are trying to bring across is actually that this kind of bridging can happen at all steps of the scientific process. So from the generation of research question, what should we actually study, to the design of experiments, the acquisition of data, to the interpretation of the data, we can actually be guided by first-person insights, for example, from contemplative traditions. So now the question is, what should we actually study using this approach? And Varela and his colleagues already pointed to one potential very fruitful field of investigation. So they said that in this bridging that can be achieved by relying on practices such as mindful awareness, they note quite an impressive convergence in in the themes concerning the self and the relation between subject and object. So it seems that the topic or the experience of the self is actually, or might actually be, a very fruitful topic of investigation. And this was actually done by a series of studies that was implemented by Aviva, and I'm going to shortly talk about two of these projects, and then we'll jump into a current project that we are running at the moment and tell a little bit about that. And this is done not only by Aviva and us, but also Yochai Ataria, who is an expert in phenomenology, Yair Dor Seidemann, a neuroscientist and meditator, and Yoav Schweitzer, who is actually now working on this in Israel. And the starting point for these investigations was a conceptualization in cognitive science that Aviva already mentioned, which is the differentiation between a narrative self, or the experience of the self and as an object of our experience. So when we are thinking about ourselves, when we are having kind of judgmental thoughts, what did I do good, what did I do bad, how should I improve, things like that. And then there's a different aspect, which is the minimal self, which is our sense of self in the here and now, having some kind of bodily existence and being somehow in control of our movements, of our thoughts. And finally, contemplative traditions actually enrich this picture, as was already mentioned by Aviva also, by a more, perhaps we can call it selfless, or I think there are a lot of other terms for that, by a mode of experience which is devoid of these aspects of self. And you might also want to call it pure consciousness or something like that. And these studies actually try to go into this and actually make that accessible to science. So in the first study, 12 long-term meditators were asked to go into these different modes of self-experience. For the narrative self, they were asked, or the instruction was to try to think of what characterizes you. For the minimal self, they were asked to try to experience what is happening to you at the present moment. And for the selfless mode, they were asked to try to experience what is happening in the present moment when you're not in the center. And during the experiment, they were asked to repeatedly go into these different states. And the neural analysis showed that when going from the narrative self into the minimal self, there was a deactivation or a decrease in gamma oscillations in medial frontal regions, which is a part of the default mode network. And when going from the minimal self into the selfless mode, there was also a change in brain activity. So here, this was in a different frequency range, the beta band. And here we also see a decrease in medial frontal, but also in medial parietal regions. And one cluster of deactivation that I want to highlight is here in the lateral parietal cortex, because here we find something interesting also from the first-person reports. When the meditators left the MEG scanner, they were asked to describe their experience during these different states. And some of them just said that in the selfless mode, there was just less happening. Less, for example, less naming of experience and less verbal content. Whereas some reported some kind of strange alterations in experience, such as, for example, floating above the entrance door between the room and the lab. And a third group of the meditators said something that was here labeled lack of ownership. So, for example, here one of them says, there was an experience, but it had no address. It was not attached to a center or subject. And the meditators who were in this group, they were actually those with the highest amount of meditation practice, or the most years and hours of meditation practice. And they were actually those driving the deactivations in the lateral parietal regions. And this is kind of interesting because this is a region that's associated with spatial awareness and the integration of information with respect to our body, with respect to where and kind of who we are in space. And a follow-up study worked with only one of these meditators, Stephen Folder, who is a Vipassana meditator, actually the founder of the Israeli Insight Meditation Society, Tovana. And it seemed that he is able to go into meditative states in a very reliable and deep way, quite on demand, and that his articulation of experience was quite precise and consistent and replicable. So it seemed to be an ideal subject for these investigations.
To go out of the boundary is
okay.
You can put it next to the speaker.
This one you can put the speaker.
You put the mic next to the speaker.
Yeah, that's right. So in the video, it's just an example of a description he gives when he goes into this more selfless mode of experiences. And in these investigations, this was characterized as the sense of boundaries. So I hope you can hear it.
to go out of the
No, this
boundary
one. This one.
is
Okay,
another level of
that's
relaxation.
this
It's
one from there.
a deeper level of letting go, of surrender, of a sense that there's no need for center. And as if I'm falling out of the center. That's the best language I can give. I'm falling out of the center of even of sensations. There's no sensations. It's like falling into space. The best description, someone once told me an image. It's like jumping out of a plane without a parachute, and you're afraid. It's like, I'm not afraid anymore because I've done it so much. Is to fall into space, but then you realize there's no ground, so it doesn't really matter anymore. So it has a feeling of no ground and falling into space, and no need to be located anywhere.
Okay, I'll try it.
Okay, this is just as an example of a part of the description of this experience, and through the qualitative analysis of this interview, this state or the processes of boundary dissolution was described through several dimensions or aspects, such as, for example, a sense of having a certain location, where he says that in the dissolved state, it's all background, the body is spread, it's very difficult to know where it is and what it is. Another example is the sense of agency or controlling what is happening. And he says there's just no sense of controlling in this state. And similarly, the sense of ownership disappears. There's no sense of what's mine or what's not mine. And these first-person descriptions or phenomenological descriptions were now front-loaded into the design of a neuroscientific experiment, and he was asked to go into 3 different levels of this dissolution process, which are called SB1, 2, 3. And he was asked to go repeatedly into these different states. While MEG activity was measured, and the results showed again, this time a more pronounced or stronger deactivation in lateral parietal regions, but also again medial parietal regions that we have seen before when going from the default into the dissolved states. So, yeah, I hope I have given you some examples of how this circulation between these different perspectives can happen. For example, by generating hypotheses about observable states, in this case, what was called selflessness, front-loading in phenomenological insights into the design of experiments, using or acquiring first-person data during the experiment. And another way of bridging this gap can be done through cognitive modeling that is actually reliable or pays attention to both domains, to the third-person data, but it's also can also be realized within first-person perspective. So, in a current study, we are trying to go into that direction and also come up with a cognitive model of full-fledged minimal self-experience. So, the overall aims for this study are first to replicate these results in a larger sample. So we are working now with 50 meditators who get a 3 weeks training by this teacher and experienced meditator to familiarize themselves with this concept and process of boundary dissolution. And again, we are using MEG. We are now targeting certain or specific neurocognitive mechanisms, and then we are also interested in the ability or the possibility of actually enhancing or strengthening this sense of boundaries. And this might be interesting because there's some recent evidence or descriptions in the literature showing that the experience of such kind of self-dissolution or boundary dissolution can sometimes be experienced as something very blissful, but also sometimes it can have a very terrifying or can be full of fear and terror. And finally, we are also interested how the ability to regulate the boundaries and the flexibility in this experience, how that relates to other phenomena such as social qualities and well-being. So this is just an overview of the studies. We have the sample, they complete the 3 weeks training, they completed a bunch of online questionnaires, and then they came to the MEG lab twice. And here's just a video of how that looks like when we are running an experiment. So here the meditator is lying and we are preparing him. He gets ECG and we are actually applying some tactile stimulation here to the chest. We are measuring his head shape, and then he's put into the MEG scanner, which has 256 sensors, which are shown here on the screen. So the cognitive model that we are trying to develop is actually based on the predictive processing account that has been mentioned before by Aviva also. I won't be able to give a full introduction into this theory. It is something that is gaining a lot of attention at the moment in neuroscience, also in artificial intelligence. And let me just say that at least some interpretations of this view are quite consistent with the neurophenomenological approach, or with the idea that the brain is not reconstructing or representing some objective reality out there, but that actually through the processes of our existence we enact this meaningful world that we are living in. And according to this theory, the brain is not kind of a computer or input-output machine, but it's rather corresponds to a very densely connected and dynamic hierarchical network, which is constantly busy anticipating the future possibilities or the future ways of how we can stay alive, or how we can stay within the boundaries of our habitual existence. And importantly for this project, there are a couple of mechanisms specified or specifiable within this framework, such as the integration of multisensory information related to the body, which is has been suggested to be related to, or to giving rise to, a sense of body ownership. That kind of all the information, for example, when I'm moving my hand, I get synchronous visual input about my hand, but at the same time I feel, or I have a tactile kind of internal sensation of that hand. So this kind of correlatedness is supposed to give rise to a sense of ownership of, this is my hand. At the same time, the prediction of sensory consequences of movement is supposed to give rise to a sense of agency. I'm in control of this. And the regulation of the interoceptive milieu is supposed to give rise to the coloring of our experience in an affective and emotional way. And we are using certain neurocognitive paradigms to measure those processes. I won't go into details. But then we ask meditators to actually shift between those states repeatedly. So we hope through that we get a rigorous assessment of these processes and can test their involvement in these different states. And these are all event-related potentials. So it's a clearly quantifiable neural marker. But what we also need in order to test the hypotheses, how that relates to these aspects of self-experience, we also need a precise mapping of the first-person experience. And here Ohad will give you some more details.
I have a couple of questions,
Yes.
but maybe after you finish, should I take it?
Yeah. If it's
It's
necessary.
related.
If
Will
it's
be
clever.
present. You will be continuing from
Yeah,
where he
yeah,
left.
yeah.
Okay. And
I'm
maybe
going to
that
talk
was
now
the
more
end.
about the phenomenological side, trying to really explain what we did in terms of gathering information about people's experience in this research. So by talking about that, I'm kind of trying to show you the intricacies of really gathering this data in an empirical setting. It's not something that science is usually used to working with. But we kind of hope to show, as Mathis explained, that by gathering this information in an organized, fruitful way, we can really inform the neural analysis and make the entire process of neuroscience become more better, more efficient. So I would say that generally the aim of the philosophical, the phenomenological investigation is to clarify what it is like to experience a change in the minimal self while changing one's sense of boundaries. There is in reality, according to the people that I've spoken with, over 40 subjects that we had, many variations in the experiences that people have. So you know, from a scientific perspective, that's very important to kind of try and characterize these different experiences, so that we can really identify what Mathis showed before, these distinguishable phenomenological categories, or perhaps we can call it experiential parameters that change during these experiences. So if we kind of are able to map these things, we can also connect them much better to the cognitive understanding of the self and this phenomena. So as Mathis said, we're going to focus on these specific experiential parameters that have been discussed in previous research and are well defined, which is the sense of agency, ownership, and self-location, even though there are others that have come up during the interviews and are interesting to note. So the main goal is really not only to really discern what are these experiential parameters that define our sense of boundaries, but also really attempt to map each participant on this map that we're creating. And by doing that, we will be able to kind of connect these information much better to the neural data that we're having. So quickly go through the workflow of the experiment. So there was the MEG measurement, or questionnaires that were taken before by the subjects, but after the MEG measurement, or actually during the MEG measurement, I've been acquiring self-rating of the meditator. So they would say what, really give a basic rating of how deep was their meditation and how stable was it, so that we can get a grip of the different changes that they had from time to time. But this is a very kind of basic initial rating, whereas later I have conducted phenomenological interviews, 30 to 50 minutes each, that I will explain a bit about them in a second. But according to these interviews, we are later trying, we plan to analyze this and yeah, exactly to actually what I was just saying, map these participants in a way that we can integrate with neurophysiological analysis. So it starts to play automatically, but I want to give you one example of a Hebrew interview that I've done with a yoga and meditation teacher that was part of one of our subjects, and she says, it's actually in Hebrew, so I will translate it simultaneously. She says, as I meditate, there's an I, there's a self who observes sensations. And then she says, I really ask myself, who is that which is observing? And then there's this even physical experience of sort of, I'm looking backwards to look at who's looking, like that. And then it becomes like, poof. Yeah, a screen, sort of something explodes, and I don't know, I don't understand where I am I? It doesn't make sense. It's a moment of disorganization. So that's like I guess a good example to show not only of like the description and the type of experiences that we're encountering, but also how even though during the meditation it is still kind of experienced through this mental, almost physical gesture of the body, kind of like looking inwards, which really changes the entire spatial framework of her experience. So I'm going to talk more about this specifically, the aspect of self-location. So there's a bunch of parts of interviews that I've collected to kind of give you this sense of the different kind of experiences we're encountering. So one subject said, it's as if I'm present in all of space altogether, like all of the space that my consciousness surrounds in this moment. It's like my presence is something much bigger than, say, just where my body is located. Rather, who I am is present in a very large space, large at least like, say, a building or something like that. And then another subject says, I allow my hands to just kind of melt into each other, to stop feeling so distinct. My hand is kind of immersed in the other hand, or my bottom is immersed in the cushion or in the bed. When it sinks, there is a sense of penetrating the boundaries in a certain way. So what I'm trying to show here is that we have very different experiences. One of them is like having to do with this feeling of expansion into a vast space, whereas the other one is much more localized on a very specific part of the body. And then I'll give you two more examples. So I asked this one subject to describe her experience of space, and she said, it's not my experience of space. You're like a ray of light or something like that, a wave. It's like you're part of some stream or flow. The sensation extends from the limbs. I begin to feel the dissolution in sensations, and then it has no boundary anymore. It's hard to explain what is this no boundary. And then the final one says it's a feeling of like an orb, a little bit of dissolving into the air. It doesn't completely dissolve, but it's in space, in the room, and up in the air. So again, another two different experiences. And what I want to show by these examples is to explain the kind of analysis that we'll do or have already started doing which can really group these different participants to different groups. So these 4 examples, I've chosen them because they are representative of what I feel to be a trend in generally with all our participants, in a sense that we could group them to these different groups, kind of in an organized way. So one would be like this expansion into a vast space. The other one would be localized in the head, observing sensations of local body parts. Then the other one would be really like no self-location, this formless or really a dissolution of the structure of experience, and also this kind of intentional structure of experience, this subject-object, knower-known distinction that we usually have. And then another one is a more general bodily centered sphere. So this is really initial and can still be refined, but again, the idea is that by taking all these participants and kind of grouping them to different groups, we can then go back to the neural analysis and be much more kind of informed in the kind of data that we expect to find. And so I want to show, like, just briefly another example of the sense of agency that has to do with the sense of control or effort that is being exerted. So one subject said, it's like a balloon that's inflating upwards, downwards. I feel active, as if there is some gravitational force pulling me into some kind of center, and that my action here is to kind of try to maintain and keep blowing up this balloon. Then another subject said, sometimes dissolving the boundaries is possible, and it happens again. I don't want it, it just happens, there's no intention. Then I ask her if she's passive, and she says, I'm not passive because I am not. There is no me to be passive. Either it happens or it doesn't. So again, this can show you of like this very different ways to dissolve your boundaries. One is kind of actively blowing up her sense of space, and one has no agency at all. And what we try to show by this is that potentially here we can not only group them into different groups, but also put them on a scale that is gradual, that's continuous, so that we are, in terms of data analysis, we can really get much better grip of what's happening. And then there's another example which is kind of in the middle of these two. What I do is bring the attention outside of what's going on right now, and then go into a state of imagining the sky. So I had thoughts, and then fairly quickly I noticed them, and then went back to the sky. So he's actively doing this diverting of attention, but he's also kind of trying to remain in a rather passive way. So we could think of it as a sort of middle ground of being passive, but kind of having this intention going on. So I hope that these ideas kind of help you get a better sense of the actual way that we're performing this study. There is, I feel like, a lot more to be discussed, and we're kind of trying to push this and make it more manageable. But you would be the ones to judge. I want to end by talking on a more general, again, look on what we're doing. And also this kind of science that we're trying to promote and how it may relate to human values. So this conference is about the possibility of a dialogue about values between two worlds, that of the contemplative tradition and that of science. So science is wonderfully clarifying, reliable, and systematically convincing. But in its careful analytical tools, it tends to break reality into separate pieces and sometimes drain them of meaning and purpose in favor of this narrow conception of truth and utility. Contemplative traditions, on the other hand, aim for a much more personal quest towards transformation. They are concerned with ethical and normative aspects of our lives. But this depth many times comes in the cost of ambiguity, or perhaps sometimes even outdated mysticism. So to me it seems important that we remember that rather than actually two separate worlds, it is better to see them as two different mindsets within which we all tend to alternate. Two domains of discourse which people use in order to think and talk and ask questions and really make sense of the worlds. So if we see them as such, the question becomes even much more burning. How can they relate to one another? And how can they complement one another? How can this dialogue really help us understand things better and ever deeper? So if I would summarize our point from this entire talk, science really has to acknowledge experience as an integral part of any understanding of reality, and also follow the well-paved path of training attention, whereas contemplative traditions can benefit from a process of clarification and empirical testing of their theories. So I feel that what we offered here today is an image of science that really aims towards integrating such dialogue in its methodology. It recognizes that in order to make sense of our nature, we have to build meaningful bridges between these different approaches that are rooted in open exploration and cultivation of our lives. So this is not just an elegant idea, but really a way to do better neuroscience. So to implement first-person methodologies and work with contemplative experts is one important step in that direction, but we can really go a step further and call back into modern science the ancient ideal of the wise man, according to which recognizing truth is not some process of mere conceptual understanding, but necessarily it is also a process of self-transformation. This is an ideal that I think is completely neglected, or not completely, but mostly neglected by science and scientists today. I think that we as cognitive scientists find ourselves in a special position in that regard, because we are studying the mind of which we only have one direct acquaintance with, that is with our own minds. So when scientists truly take on the challenge of understanding the nature of the mind through practicing enhanced states of being, they, or we, may begin merging into our intellectual and our experimental activity or contemplative practices. And that is a call that's already being answered gradually with Mind and Life Institute, if you've heard of that, probably discussed here. A call to create a mindful dynamics of empirical research, a community of mindful researchers who reconstruct the aims, problems, and meanings of their study. So I think that this is where matters of ethics really become kind of necessarily intertwined with the work of the scientists. For the scientist in this image of science is not someone that sits securely outside observing into his field of inquiry, but rather he is an integral part of that very field. How we think and how we talk and conceptualize and also plan our research are all inseparable from who we are and who we can become. Embodied minds that are closely entangled within the world which they are endlessly making sense of. A science that acknowledges this can become a science of value and of meaning. So Francisco Varela, this is not what I thought that will show up, but Francisco Varela finishes his proposal of neurophenomenology. This was supposed to be the image of the dialogue, but I'll finish with this quote of Varela. And he says, to the long-standing tradition of objectivist science, this sounds anathema, and it is. But this is not a betrayal of science. It is a necessary extension and complement. Anathema, if this is not clear, because I didn't know that word, it's like an abomination, a hateful kind of thing. But this is not a betrayal of science. It is a necessary extension and complement. Science and experience constrain and modify each other as in a dance. And this is where the potential for transformation lies. It is also the key for the difficulties this position has found within the scientific community. It requires us to leave behind a certain image of how science is done and to question a style of training in science which is part of the very fabric of our cultural identity. So I really find it vital that spiritual teachers and practitioners will recognize that they are not in any boxing battle with science as a whole, but only perhaps with somewhat naive, kind of narrow objectivist worldviews. On the contrary, we ought to be able to create a dialogue where all these voices can be heard and learn from one another, so that we could all take part and really dance this neurophenomenological dance. And as we all dance together, perhaps we may find that we have reached closer to an integrated understanding of consciousness and of nature. Thank you.